Welcome back. In our last session, we saw the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. That ministry will bring about, as we shall see, a rather increasing animosity between the various groups of the Jewish leadership and Jesus and his disciples. That animosity will lead in the end to the Passion narrative and Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus began with a parable about tenant farmers, which led the leadership to see themselves and their relationship with God. This then spawned two questions to Jesus: a political question on taxation from the Pharisees and the scribes, and a theological question on resurrection from the Sadducees. We continue the Jerusalem ministry in this session. Jesus, having been questioned by the authorities, now poses his own question on how Jesus can be Lord and Son of David at one and the same time. A rather thorny and tricky question, to say the least. This will be followed by Jesus' estimation of the scribes and his warning to others concerning them. Then Jesus and his disciples go out of the city and sit opposite the temple, observing the various people putting in their offerings into the temple. In this, one particular widow stands out. We'll hear about her. Then we shall end the session with a look at the great discourse of Jesus on the end times, the Lucan version of what's come to be known as the apocalyptic discourse. There's no formal introduction to the unit here, no identification of whom Jesus is speaking with. The unit begins simply with the question of Jesus. Luke begins, "He said to them," with the particle de, which would signal a change. Here a change in questioner, as Jesus turns the tables on his opponents. Then the question: how do they say that the Christ is the Son of David? The title Son of David was a very popular messianic title in the first century, especially in Rabbinic Judaism. Arnold notes that it first appeared as a formal title in the Psalms of Solomon, in particular Psalms of Solomon chapter 17 verse 21, which was a first century Pharisaic writing with political overtones. The concept goes back to the promises of God to David through the prophet Nathan in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, 11 verses 11 to 16. This title refers to Davidic descent rather than being a title. Then the reason for the question is presented. David himself says in the book of Psalms, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I should make your enemies your footstool,' or a stool for your feet." The citation of David is Psalm 110, verse 1. The explanation of this is dependent on how one works out the characters of the first line. It seems that the Lord is God himself, known to the Jews as Adonai. He speaks to David's Lord, designated by the pronominal adjective my, and presumably David's Lord is the Messiah. This Lord of David, Messiah King, is to take the place of honor next to the throne of God. "Sit at my right hand." The Messiah King is to keep this place of honor until God has taken care of all his enemies. The phrase, "make your enemies a stool for your feet," is a way of saying destroy or subject them. They will be the footrest on which the Messiah will rest his feet. Thus they will be in subjection to him. The original question is then repeated in light of the citation of Psalm 110:1. David calls him, the Messiah, Lord. And how is he, the Messiah, his, David's, son? The real question is, how can David call a son a descendant by the title Lord? In the society of the day, this would be extraordinary. In that society, a son would be under his father, subject to him. So then, Jesus' question actually is, how can the great King David reflect submission to a descendant? And correspondingly, who can be greater than Israel's great king? The answer is not given. Rather, the hearer is left to ponder the question and come to one's own conclusion. The question does lead one to a reflection that may lead to an understanding of who Jesus is. Luke will eventually give an answer in 22:69. We must therefore wait for that. Having raised what will become a key Christological question, Jesus now turns to those who are well versed in the law to warn his disciples against their hypocrisy. Their outward actions do not correspond with their inward intentions. Outwardly, they're all pious and religious, yet they act unjustly and defer the laws of God whenever and wherever they can. The audience for this warning is clearly delineated. In the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples. Jesus means this as a warning to his disciples, but it's not a private warning. It's delivered in the hearing of all. And so he begins. Beware of the scribes. The Greek verb proseko, which is used here, has the sense of turn your mind toward. However, when it's used in conjunction with the preposition apo, it has the opposite meaning. Turn your mind from, or more colloquially, be aware of. Following that imperative, Jesus presents 6 criticisms, 6 things that the disciples need to watch out for in the scribes. First, they desire to walk in long robes. The long flowing robe, or the stole, was worn by those who served as some sort of functionaries, that is, soldiers, priests, kings. Thus, the desire of the scribes for such robes belied their secret desire to wear them to denote the high function or office they considered themselves to have. Second, they loved greetings in the marketplaces. These greetings were not merely a friendly hello, but rather a greeting that clearly demonstrated the respect that the other had for the scribe, a public recognition of their prominence. They seemingly went to the marketplaces simply to get such adulation. Third, they loved the prime seats in the synagogues, the protokathedrias. These were the seats directly in front of the raised platform where the prayer leader stood. Those seats would give them a good view of what was happening in the service, while at the same time allowing them to see everybody, and correspondingly be seen by everybody. It was considered an honor to be brought to those seats before the synagogue service. This and the preceding one had already been treated by Luke in chapter 11 on the woes to the Pharisees, where he said, "Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seats in synagogues and salutations in the marketplaces." Fourth, they loved prime seats at banquets. This may be similar to the first seats in the synagogue. Meals were a significant social time in the ancient world. Guests at meals would be seated according to their social status. We saw this social stratification earlier when we discussed the choosing of seats at a banquet or a dinner. Jesus there advised his followers to choose the lowest seat, so they could be honored when the host ushered them up higher. That advice seemingly was not acceptable to the scribes, who always sought the first seats. Fifth, scribes are those who devour houses of widows. Here Jesus accuses the scribes of extorting from widows. The actual extortion may take the form of offering their help in settling the widow's estate, and then taking for themselves more than was their rightful due. Or perhaps they may have taken unfair advantage of material support that was volunteered by the widows. You will note that we saw a number of women, some of whom may have been widows, who provided for Jesus from their means. See chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. This may also have been the case with the scribes, except they may have taken advantage of the widow's generosity. Finally, for pretense or for show, they pray long prayers. Scribes could be seen praying publicly, but in reality they were making a show by multiplying the words of their prayer, so that people would see how pious and holy they were. Yet some scholars have seen a connection between this and the preceding. To cover for their ill actions towards widows, they make long prayers. Nolan notes that the emphasis on devouring widows' houses and making long prayers shows that the scribes' actions, both toward their fellow human being and toward God, are to be held as suspect. With stark realism, Jesus simply says they will receive the greater judgment or condemnation. They are the ones learned in God's ways. They are the ones who should know better. So they should know that God required humility, sincerity, in love, not an ostentatious show of hypocrisy. Here is a mosaic of the marketplace. You can see that much is happening, people buying, selling, and carrying their goods. The scribe would enter into this expecting to be recognized for his office. Jesus cautions his followers that a simple greeting, shalom, the Hebrew way of saying hello, will do. From the hypocrisy and greed of the scribes, we move now to the generosity of one simple widow. There is no indication of a change of locale, such as we find in the narrative of Mark. Rather, Luke begins noting that Jesus looked up to see the rich people throwing their gifts into the gazophalakion, which was the temple treasury. It was one of the various rooms of the temple, or some would see it as a chest or something of that sort, into which money could be deposited. The Mishnah, Tractate Sekal 6:1-5, speaks of 13 shofar chests, receptacles shaped like a trumpet, located in the temple, used for various kinds of offerings. The verb to throw, balo in Greek, would fit appropriately with this. In contrast, he notes a poor widow who put in 2 copper coins, 2 lepta, given the denarius as a day's wage, as we have seen above. The lepton would equal about wages for 3 minutes, and so the widow's offering was about 6 minutes' wages. In other words, a very paltry amount. Jesus then comments on the woman's offering. He begins with the typical introduction to something of which he wishes the people to pay particular attention. Truly I tell you. Then his observation. This poor widow threw in more than all of them. The relative value of this woman's offering, extremely small though it be, is quite great in comparison to the significant offerings of the rich. As we shall see in the next verse, she gave her all, 100%, which is quite a significantly greater gift than those who gave from what they could spare. They gave more money, but she gave more. Jesus then gives the reason for his observation. They, the rich, threw in or offered from their excess or abundance what they could spare. The widow, however, contributed everything she had to live on. Bach puts it well. Little gifts can be taken for granted or not even noticed. Yet sometimes they are in fact the biggest gifts of all. The text prompts us to ask ourselves about our motives with charitable acts. Do we truly give of ourselves, or do we give spare time, spare money, whatever we may have? The focus on the temple, which was introduced in the narrative of the widow's mite, remains. But now it's shifted from the present beauty of the grand temple of Jerusalem to its destruction. In the great discourse on the end times, Jesus predicts the end of the temple, and more significantly, the end of the temple economy. The text is known as the eschatological or apocalyptic discourse. Both of these terms come from, you guessed it, Greek. Eschatological comes from an adjective eschatos, which means last. Hence, it's a discussion of the last things. Apocalyptic comes from a noun, apocalypsis, which means revelation. Hence, this discourse is a revelation of the end of the temple, but it also carries a hint of revelation of the final days that we may experience. Let's turn to the discourse proper now. The discourse opens with an observation that some were speaking about or concerning the temple, noting how it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive offerings. Jesus replies to this, "These things, these stones which you see, the days will come in which a stone will not be left upon a stone that will not be destroyed." The picture is what the great temple of Jerusalem was to have looked like in the days of Jesus. The marble work of the building and the gold shimmering in the sunlight made it a most significant and magnificent home for Israel's God. It would seem right that the people would marvel at it. Jesus quietly and calmly says that its days are nearing completion. The days are coming when it will be destroyed. The shock of that thought leads his hearers to ask a double question. The first concerns the time. "Teacher, when will this be?" And the second concerns the signs of the destruction. What is the sign when these things are about to take place? These two questions are interrelated. The first is precise regarding a time. The second asks what the general time frame of the future event might be. Such signs might be increasing turmoil in the Middle East, which ultimately led to the city of Jerusalem being surrounded, as occurred in the year 70 AD. In fact, the entire rest of the discourse is an answer to these two questions. So Jesus begins, "See to it that you are not misled." The verb blepo, used here with the negative may, has the sense of beware. In other words, test what you might think is a sign of the end. Why? There will be false signs. For example, many will claim to be Jesus. Many will come in my name. They are false messiahs. Many will come in my name saying, "I am he," ego eimi. And the time is at hand, kairos eniken. They're not to be believed or followed. Don't go after them, Jesus commands. The "I am he" is a play on the name of God, which many translate as "I am who am," or simply as "I am," in Greek ego eimi. The word for time is kairos, which refers not simply to time, clock time, but rather to the right time, the proper time, the opportune time. So besides claiming to be Jesus returned, these false prophets will announce that their time is the opportune time for the end to come. Jesus cautions, don't believe them. From these very specific signs, we move to ones that are more general. When you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified. A common response to war is alarm. Jesus cautions his disciples that there will be wars and uprisings in the near future, but that's not to disturb them. This must first take place. Note, there is a divine necessity at work here. These things are all part of a great plan of God that will slowly unfold to his disciples. Thus, as Nolan puts it, the specific reason provided for not being terrified is the divine necessity that God is in control of this apparently chaotic and out of control unfolding of events. The end will not take place instantly. It will not be at once. This is yet another attempt to counter the general thought at Luke's time that the Lord would be coming soon. We've seen how Luke has altered the Lord's Prayer and the Passion predictions to show that the expected return of the Lord may not be that immediate. This is yet another instance of that. Continuing the general prediction, Jesus says, nations will rise against nation, and kingdoms against kingdom. This is essentially a repeat of the warning concerning wars and uprisings. Then he continues with a series of natural disasters. There will be earthquakes in various places, famines, pestilences, and finally Luke adds, there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. These are the signs that the end is coming. These are not themselves the end. Many times when there's an uprising in a foreign country or an earthquake or some other natural disaster in our own times, there are those who say, this is it. The end is near. The Bible predicted it. Uprisings, earthquakes, and natural disasters have been with us from time immemorial. So they are not the harbingers of the end. Jesus is clear to counter any overzealous apocalyptic thinking, showing that these events are typical of human history and should not be confused with the end. That's a message that's just as valid today as it was in the days of Jesus and the days of Luke. Again, a change, this time from the general back to the specific. Jesus cautions his disciples what they can expect in living out belief in his name. Moreover, in fact, what is about to be described will precede the cosmic disasters just narrated, as evidenced by the prepositional phrase, before all this, pro touton panton. They will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This could be referring to a persecution that the Lucan community had or was actually experiencing. It may even refer to the persecution which Jesus endured at the hands of the Jews and the Romans, and which the Lucan community continues to experience. That will be a great opportunity for them, an opportunity to bear witness. The Greek word for witness, marturia, is the word that gives us the English martyr. Thus, they will have the opportunity to be martyrs in the original sense, those who hear and give witness to the faith in Jesus Christ. This is a difficult thing, for that witness could lead to further conversions. It could lead also to persecution. It could even lead to death. So, they are not to think too long on how they will answer when questioned. God will give them the wisdom and the understanding that no one will contradict. And in doing so, they will be a prophetic witness, a witness who speaks the word of another, God and Jesus Christ. The agents of deliverance will in many cases be members of one's own family. You will be delivered up even by parents, brothers, kinsmen, and friends. And the worst case scenario is that some will be put to death. In the strict observance of Judaism, acceptance of Jesus as Messiah and as Son of God could result in excommunication or even stoning. Later, Jewish legislation declared that anyone who accepted Jesus was to have the Jewish ritual of the dead read over them. This would be a form of excommunication. One who believes in Jesus can expect to be hated by all on account of that belief in his name. The thought here is very similar to the beatitude Jesus uttered in chapter 6. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you, and cast out your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Luke 6:22. This dire prediction concludes with a statement of assurance, however. Not a hair on your head will perish. In the midst of everything, the disciple will be protected. Jesus then gives the secret to surviving in these turbulent times. It can be summed up in one word: endurance, in Greek, hupomone. By your endurance, you will gain your lives. In the midst of trial and persecution, and even imminent death, the disciples are called upon to endure. This is the great apocalyptic virtue. The virtue of endurance gives the answer to those who see the end in every little upheaval or trial in the world. Whatever the difficulties are, hang in there. Do not abandon the faith. Do not abandon trust in God. God will protect us. We must endure. With these principles in mind, it makes no difference what's going on around us. Whatever it is, it should remind us to put our trust in God and hold fast to that trust. For it is in holding on to that trust that we will gain our lives eternally. Hupo, under, mone, remain. Remain under, endure, and you will gain your lives. Suke. From the need for endurance, Jesus moves to the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the most specific that the apocalyptic discourse gets. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, the encirclement of Jerusalem will be a definite sign that it is the end, that its desolation is near. Luke chooses to be more specific than Mark in naming the city of Jerusalem, rather than an obscure reference to the abomination that desolates. When that occurs, there is then little time for action. So, those in Judea, those in the surrounding countryside, in other words, are to flee to the mountains. Stay away from the city. Those inside the city are to depart, get out, and those outside the city in the country are to stay out. Later, church historian Eusebius records that the command to flee to the mountains may have been the impetus for many in the Christian community to flee to a city of Perea called Pella, in the face of the oncoming Roman armies. But, as Fitzmyer points out, we have no way of knowing the truth of it. The reason for all of this is that the days are days of vengeance. This is a phrase which seems to be unclear to many of the interpreters. Marshall seems to have the best explanation for it, however. The people are to flee to, quote, avoid being involved in the divine judgment upon Jerusalem, for these are to be days of vengeance. This has been prophesied, hence, to fulfill all that has been written. Certain groups will find these days very difficult to bear. Pregnant and nursing women, particularly. Hence, Luke introduces the section concerning them with the interjection, ouai. It expresses a concern at the thought of the fate of these. Jesus continues, great distress will be in the land, and wrath upon this the Jewish people. The people of Israel will pay for their misdeeds when the Roman armies come in AD 70. Some will wish death, falling on their swords. Others will be captured and led away as spoils of the Roman troops. And Jerusalem itself will once again be destroyed, so that not one stone will be left upon another. The siege will last until the triumph of the Romans over Jerusalem is complete. The situation was described in the first book of Maccabees, where it said, the sanctuary was trampled down, and aliens held the citadel. It was a lodging place for the Gentiles. Joy was taken from Jacob. 1 Maccabees 3:45. From the destruction of Jerusalem, the text jumps to the cosmic signs that will accompany the return of the Son of Man. It was thought that upon the heels of the conquering Roman armies, the Son of Man would return triumphantly to herald in the end of the age. Hence, the picture of cosmic destruction that accompanies the coming of the Son of Man. There will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and the stars. Consider the helplessness that people feel in the face of a natural disaster. That's what's being conveyed here. There is great distress, tension, and anxiety among the nations because they're perplexed by what they're experiencing. They do not know what to do. The war scroll at Qumran has described the lead-up to the return of the Messiah or the Son of Man. It will be a time of suffering for all people, the war scroll says, redeemed by God. Of all their sufferings, none will be like this. From its haste until eternal redemption is fulfilled. War Scroll, Column 1, lines 11 and 12. The mood created by contemplating these cosmic events cannot be imagined. It paints a very solemn and somber picture. Men fainting with fear, with the foreboding of what's coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Think about it. What does that mean? And then the great coming. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in great power and glory. This is taken directly from the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel, verses 13 and 14. The first book of Enoch takes this image from Daniel and develops it in terms of the Messiah. The image has developed through the Old Testament and intertestamental literature to the point where the Son of Man is a regal figure who receives kingdom, authority, etc., and comes with superhuman majesty. So, the timetable has been delineated. People should be well aware. Jesus says, when these things begin, look up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. This is the time toward which the entire gospel is drawing. It's the moment when the consummation of all that has been promised draws near, as Peter will declare in Acts 3. He says, repent therefore and turn again, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshment may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time for establishing all that God spoke of by the mouth of his holy prophets of old. Then, utilizing the image of a fig tree once more, Jesus says, know the signs of the times. Then there are some appended sayings on being ready and being prepared. The discourse ends with the apocalyptic answer. Watch and pray for strength. These are the two present imperative verbs which in Greek grammar denote a constant state of action. In other words, watch and pray constantly for strength. Strength to escape the trials described here, and strength to stand before the Son of Man. So the basic message of Jesus in regards to the end times is to live constantly in the present as though it were the end. Therefore, one will always be ready. One will always be watchful. One will always be prepared. It's good advice for all of us who look forward to the coming of the kingdom. Well, that's about it for this session. We've looked at the discussion of Jesus as son and Lord of David, the appraisal of Jesus of the scribes, and the widow's offering to the temple, known as the narrative of the widow's mite. We ended with Jesus' discourse on the final things and saw what our stance should be in light of the end. Next time, we'll look at the last days of Jesus' life, the Last Supper, and the Passion narrative according to Luke. See you then.